Hey there everyone, and welcome to Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Battaji. It was an absolute privilege to sit down and have today's conversation with Professor Stuart Phillips. Dr. Phillips is a professor of kinesiology at McMaster University in Canada. He's widely regarded as one of the foremost experts in protein and muscle. In a career that has spanned over 30 years and over 400 scientific publications, his contributions cannot be underestimated. So much of our understanding of what happens to our muscles as we age, the best resistance training protocols to combat the age-related decline in strength, power, and muscle mass, the protein types and timing, and also how much protein we need in the day to make sure that our muscles age in the best way possible. There were so many highlights today as Dr. Phillips' research has really looked at every aspect of healthy muscle, exercise, and aging in relation to nutrition and exercise. This was a real masterclass from one of the greatest of all time in this space. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I do. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Professor Stuart Phillips. Stu Phillips, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, Tony. Appreciate it.
I have been a follower of your scientific work for multiple decades. And in this current climate where public awareness around the importance of muscle mass, strength, protein in the diet, it's at an all-time high, but it's also at an all-time place of confusion and misinformation. And today I want to talk to you as somebody who would be rightly considered one of, if not the foremost expert in the world on protein, resistance training, that interaction. You are the perfect person to have a conversation about this. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
We're going to talk about three things primarily. One is all muscle-centric, especially from the world of females as they age. But I want to look at protein and resistance training and then supplements. And I think that's probably the three areas where there is the most information. You can't open social media without this is how much protein you should have and when you should have it and the type you should have. And this is the best type of weight training if you're a female and postmenopausal. And these are the number 1, 2, and 3 best supplements to have. Now, luckily, you've actually done research in all of these areas. Most people will say they've done their research by going online and looking at what Google says, but you actually do the research that feeds into what they're looking at. And often people miss that distinction, especially on social media. That distinction's lost, that you're generating the research studies that people are quoting. And if people then go and look at the research, they'll see your name. Hundreds.
Yeah, it's a massive difference. I'm often a little baffled by this. They've done their research, and to me, and I can go to PubMed or Google Scholar and Google their name, and they might have some publications, or a lot of times they have none. And I'm like, well, I do the research. Like I generate the product that you're talking about. And I think too, a lot of people I've been doing this for some time. I published my first paper in 1993. So I'm sure some of your listeners, they're like, that was before I was born. I'm like, that's cool. I've been around for a while. So literally over 30 years now, and a lot of students who, through their hard work, really make me look good. But it's been a while.
Well, your life career has been centered around muscle. Let's start the conversation with protein because, again, public awareness has improved dramatically on the importance of protein, potentially starting the day with a protein-rich breakfast. And most people realize that protein is made up of amino acids, so that's where the debate has come versus plants and animal and what is best. But now there's nuance, and that is because of the role of hormones in females, there should be a specific timing of that relative to your exercise session, or you shouldn't exercise unless you've got protein on board. And these are things I want to really unpack with you today because everyone is confused. We understand that protein is good, and I don't think unless you're a hardcore into longevity and caloric restriction and love Drosophila
Yeah,
fly
yeah,
studies
yeah,
and
yeah,
protein.
yeah.
And I've seen
Yeah, well,
you have actually addressed some of this work for longevity, but I don't think that's our
yeah,
space. Our
you
space is
sure?
we get protein is important,
Yeah,
but let's look at the controversy. Before we do look at that in practice, how on earth do you measure how much protein we need? So when we talk about a 30-year-old female versus perimenopause versus post versus
yeah,
my 80-year-old mother, how do
yeah.
you arrive at that number? Because when I was at uni, we used a method called nitrogen balance, and that's no
Yes.
longer used. But really
No.
interestingly, when I look at some of the arguments that females should have X, 30 grams
Yeah,
of protein,
yeah,
within 45 minutes of training because of the effect of hormones, there's a citation which takes me to a 1994 study on nitrogen balance. And I'm
yeah,
scratching my head thinking, it's 2025. We actually
yeah,
have better methods. So how do we measure this stuff now versus back then?
yeah. So first, I just want to start out by saying I did nitrogen balance experiments. So I collected urine, I collected stool samples, I washed people down after they had done exercise because during exercise, blood flow to your kidney goes down, and so you produce the urea you produce doesn't get filtered into your kidney and excreted. Instead, it appears in sweat. So we did sweat washdowns of athletes, and they're delightful experiments to conduct. I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. But I mean, the flaws in the nitrogen balance method are long known. The biggest one being is that the more protein you feed somebody, the increasingly positive a nitrogen balance study goes. And that's just not physiologically possible. It should sort of come up to a certain level and then just flatten off. But that's the not to get into the nitty gritty of the method, but one of the key critiques. And I think now we have different methodology, things called the indicator amino acid oxidation method, where we're able to more accurately predict what it is that people actually need. And I often underscore that nitrogen balance probably, if nothing else, gives you a minimal estimate of what people require. And so that's reflected in the North American RDA, Australian RNI levels of protein. And generally, globally, you look around, it's about zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilo. We have advocated for a long time that people probably require more. I think at least 1.2, particularly as people get older. I think there's a ceiling as opposed to some people. And I think the ceiling is about twice the RDA. So at about 1.6 grams per kilo or about zero point 0.7 grams per pound of protein, the benefits of eating more protein really flatten off. And that's in terms of muscle or neurotransmitters or hormones or any protein requiring process. And it's interesting. You and I just we chatted briefly before. I often hear from people, they go, well, there's other protein requiring processes. And I'm like, like, dot, 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 question mark. And they're like, you make proteins. And I'm like, right, that's protein synthesis, bricks going into the wall. Like, it's not all just muscle. There is every tissue in your body is turning over. And so we're putting protein into it and we're pulling damaged proteins out of it. That's why we need protein on a daily basis. But the need for protein is driven by making new proteins and then other things. They're trivial in terms of how we utilize protein. So we focused on muscle. Everybody thinks that all the protein is in muscle, but it's in skin, it's in blood vessels, in your heart, it's in your liver, it's in your brain. 40% of your bone mass is actually protein. It's not just a stick of chalk. And we need to replace that protein every day. And we're getting pretty good at it now. And I think these sort of 1.6, maybe a little bit higher for the last little turn of the screw, so to speak, it really covers a lot of bases. I guess the question at hand is whether women are, different than men.
Yeah, so
And
let's talk about that. But before we do, what's the downside of going from, say, 1.6, 1.8 to 2.2, 2.4?
yeah,
There's some studies that go as high as 3.
yeah,
But I recently read, and I just made a few quotes here, and it is consuming 1 gram of protein per pound of current body weight, or 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight,
mhm,
can be hugely beneficial during menopause in helping preserve muscle mass and support metabolism, and stay away from intermittent fasting as it leads to muscle breakdown and metabolic slowing.
Yeah.
I think what jumps out at me is that I imagine it depends on the energy status that you're in.
Sure.
Does that change your requirements? And you've done work on looking at protein if you are dieting versus
Yep.
in energy balance. One would think that there are differences. So if you are menopausal and you're dieting versus not, how does that change things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of over focus on muscle breakdown. Like people sort of believe that if you don't get your protein for a day, like all of a sudden you're sarcopenic the next day, you're losing muscle mass. And like muscle protein turns over pretty slowly. So you'd have to have a low protein intake for a long time before something really goes sideways. Now, when you're in a caloric deficit, of course, that catabolic or that breakdown side is definitely emphasized. And I don't want to dismiss that. But once again, we've done studies where we've had men and women in pretty deep caloric deficits, and we can preserve 100% of their muscle mass or actually have them gain muscle mass by combining resistance training, which is and I mean underscore much more powerful stimulus to hang on to muscle than protein. And you might be able to nudge it up, and I would say 2.2 or 1 gram per pound, if that's what you want to do. 2.2 grams per kilo might be the upper end. And you might get a benefit, but like I don't like avoid intermittent fasting. Like why? Why would you do that? Like if you need to lose some weight, not that I'm a huge intermittent fasting fan, but I mean as a strategy for weight loss, just as good as anything else. And it's sort of this obsession around you're losing muscle and you're going to lose more during menopause. And like the broad stroke data on that shows that actually between ages 45 and 55, which is where 95% of women lose their menstrual cycle, that's 10 years. And the muscle loss that you can plot on a population level is entirely consistent with aging. It's not like there's a sharp inflection in the curve, which you would expect if estrogen is so important. So it's not that, and I, in deference, I know that you've had Dr. Severine Lamont on the podcast, and her lab, and they have data to show that actually it relates. But I think that the decline in estrogen also relates it entirely to age, and so there may be some interaction there, but it's not like people are coming down and then they kind of drop off a cliff, which is what bone does, but muscle doesn't do that.
And when we look at this idea called the catabolic crisis model, which one of your friends developed who's no longer with us, tell us more about what this proposal says about how we are losing muscle as we age.
Yeah. Full credit to the late Doug Padden-Jones. Doug was, well, first he was an Aussie, so a big tribute there from another Commonwealth country. He's an outstanding individual. Really great guy. Real shame that he passed away way sooner than he needed to, for sure. But that's been an idea and a concept that's shaped a lot of my thinking. And really, it relates to the idea that when you go into these catabolic areas, and Doug's model was that you're in hospital, you're under some sort of severe metabolic stress, you might have an infection, you may even be septic, and it's the bed rest and the disuse combined with this catabolic hormonal milieu that is characteristic of these very catabolic conditions that are not recapitulated at all in normal human physiology. I mean, these people are very sick. They tend to be older, but you can spend a long time in hospital where, as Doug would say, the de facto treatment is lay down in bed, right? And or go to space. That's the other one, right? And for those of us lucky to enjoy that, maybe more in the next few years. No gravity means you're losing muscle, and it's an accelerated form of aging. You're losing bone too. So how do we load people like when they're on these space flights? It's a hard thing to do, but it's a true catabolic. When we say crisis, I mean these people, they might live or they might die, and sepsis is a 50-50 proposition. And that's what Doug was talking about, not excessive exercise or
Right.
caloric restriction, which
Right.
can be catabolic, but
Right.
not on the scale of that crisis model.
Right. And could we extend that thinking to we've just come from a COVID era.
Yeah,
We've got
yeah,
flus that are coming around, but people are getting bed rest for a week at a time,
yes,
or a COVID era where people just would be housebound and not moving.
yeah.
Would you say that that catabolic crisis certainly extends as we are aging? And my parents who are elderly, when they get unwell, and they'll be unwell several times a year, that's a week in bed each time. Is
Sure,
that where we're
sure.
also seeing accelerated muscle loss?
Yeah, and I think that we've done these models of step reduction where we say to people, here's a hip worn pedometer, we monitor it with another device, and you can take no more than 1,000 or 1,500 steps. And everybody goes, oh, that's crazy. And I'm like, actually, hospitalized patients take about 750 steps. That's the walk around the ward
Right.
a couple
Yeah.
of times, and you're
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
And you're in bed. So yeah, older person gets sick, they get the flu, they maybe they're hospitalized for respiratory distress, but then they go home. And I know in Oz it's a little different, but in Canada we have these wicked cold winters, and it's like you're well enough to go home, but now you convalesce at home for 2 weeks. And so, yeah, you might be in bed. You might just sit on the couch. You might not do much. So it's this sort of extended sedentary period with recovering from illness that I think is a disuse moment that you're going to lose some muscle and particularly as you age. And our thinking is that you go from this curve and then you have this big crisis and you're down, you've migrated from one curve
Yeah.
to
Right.
another.
Yeah.
And in 2 to 3 weeks' time, it's the equivalent through disuse of 6, 7, 8 years of aging.
Hmm. Let's talk about women in particular, because it feels like the advice for men in terms of protein and muscle, isn't a lot of controversy. Men need X, and it might be a little
Yep.
higher than we would like, but really big deal.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
the weight training advice, it's pretty straightforward. But
Yep.
females seem to, when I look in as a male, I see that there's advice for females around the menstrual cycle and protein based on the different
Yeah.
catabolic, anabolic hormones. And
Yep.
then we see new advice around perimenopause and then new
Yep.
advice around postmenopause. And then it tends to come together again with elderly and anabolic resistance.
Yep.
Let's start first with a female who is of menstrual age. And let's ask ourselves, how do we understand the effect of hormones on protein? And I'll just give you another quote here so people can really get what we're talking about. Here's a direct quote. Studies have also shown that overall daily protein needs are higher during the luteal phase of the
Yeah.
menstrual cycle. And the sex hormone progesterone exacerbates muscle breakdown in women. It makes us more catabolic, especially during the luteal phase. Now, I went and clicked on that reference because I'm a man. I don't
Sure.
understand this, but it took me to a 1997 paper with 4 people in it looking at nitrogen balance.
Yeah.
You've done work on this, but we're assuming that the general public who are females are not going and chasing down the actual science. They'll go, oh, there's a
Yeah.
scientific study that must be true.
Yep.
Progesterone does exacerbate muscle protein breakdown, so I'll need to eat more in my menstrual cycle. How do we
Yeah.
know if that is true or not? And you've done work in this area.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just lead off by saying that for a long time, and the first paper that I published, we compared men and women, ironically enough. We called it gender differences then. We didn't talk about sex because that was a dirty word, but so we got it wrong. It was sex-based differences. And women actually oxidize a little less protein than men. The differences between luteal and follicular phases in terms of protein oxidation and protein synthesis are trivial if they exist at all. So the nitrogen balance study that you talk about, I'm familiar with the paper. Again, flawed methodology, N4. It's not something that would be the stock paper I would refer to. So there's lots of work that's been done since. We've done a little bit recently. I know you had Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple on, so I probably don't need to lecture people again on what she showed. But really, the big driver, and by big, B-I-G capital letters underscore, of muscle and everything else is still weightlifting and exercise and physical activity. And the role that protein plays is pretty small. And I think too that people need to appreciate that estrogen and progesterone is their primary functions as reproductive hormones. They're not. There's no effect that, in fact, I haven't even seen a paper in humans showing that there's a progesterone receptor on skeletal muscle. So that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It could use the estrogen receptor, and that estrogen is quote unquote anabolic. So you should lift heavy in your follicular phase and do yoga and Pilates in your luteal phase. And it's just rubbish. Like, it's absolute rubbish advice. There's no evidence behind it, not to steal anybody's thunder, but we have a study coming out. And so I'm confident in saying that it doesn't matter. So yeah, stay tuned.
Okay, exciting. When we consider the female of reproductive age, that this dance of the hormones isn't affecting real world changes in muscle mass.
Yeah.
What about then when we move to perimenopause and the menopausal transition? That's where we're seeing the recommendations that we need more protein to do what estrogen was doing. And they're typically the direct quote. Estrogen was doing X in terms of muscle, but we'll leave bone for another conversation.
Sure.
And now we need more. And I think from a protein researcher and as a coach, we tend to find people who are under protein eaters. So we're always encouraging clever ways of having more and sneaking it in there. So we're not at odds with this, but just the backing behind it is protein doing something that estrogen was doing, or is it resistance training that's really doing everything?
Yeah, look, I mean, people get a little upset when you got to unlearn something, and I acknowledge that. And sort of when you take animal models and you overectomize a rat, so you remove its ovaries, so it's the rodent equivalent of a radical hysterectomy in a woman. So that's surgical menopause, day 1 or day X, intact ovaries, everything cycling, day Y, no more. And that was done much more frequently than it is now, when women had positive pap smears, for example, so to reduce risk of cervical cancer. Done far less frequently now, but in that model, that's a pretty abrupt change. It's like an on-off switch. So for women in that category, I think it's possible they could lose some muscle, and I could go into why. I don't think it's a direct muscle mechanism, but that's not menopause. Menopause is sort of a gradual faltering of the menstrual cycle that takes place years before for most women, symptoms develop. And menopause, and I heard a great description of it, and is that it's a zone of chaos. And so women, I have to flat out admit, I'm married to a woman who's experiencing it. So vicariously, I live through it. But she's also a cardiovascular physiologist. And so she's been studying some of these cardiovascular changes. And there's a really sensitive system there that actually is quite affected by estrogen. But at the same time, I do believe that if men suffered from hot flushes or flashes, depending on what side of the world you're from, there would be a global commission to study these things, because we still don't know really why they happen. And it seems like it's a rough journey. So your sleep is disrupted. You're sleeping, it's just poor sleep, shortened sleep, disrupted sleep. Your cravings and diet and everything's a mess, and you're trying to balance that. And so the attribution of some of the things that happen during the menopausal transition to hormones is, to me, it's really hard to pull out all the other things that are going on in a woman's life, and that I think could have an adverse effect on muscle. But let's be clear, the normal age-related trajectory during that time would predict, if it's 0.8%, people round it up and say it's 1%, so that's fine, loss per year, is exactly what we see in menopausal women. And we don't see what we do with bone, which is bone density is doing this, and then it inflects. So in muscle, if estrogen, this on-off switch, which it does happen in animals, it begins to go down, but during menopause, it's going down gradually. And it should, if estrogen is having an effect, inflect. And the idea that you need more protein is that you can somehow make up for what estrogen was doing with more protein. And and I mean, I just want to stress this, zero point 0.0 data that that's true. There's nothing that shows you that that's true. So I was interviewed recently by a journalist she had written a paper or an article in a prominent newspaper on protein requirements, and then received like a slew of feedback from women saying, what about menopausal women? And so she reached out to me, and I said, there's no evidence that they have an elevated protein requirements beyond they're getting older, which is to be the same if you're a man.
And
So
let's talk about,
I,
yeah, and I think that's a really strong point. And I actually think it's really reassuring because if it hasn't changed, unlike what's happening to bone, then that's a good message. So I
yeah,
can't,
yeah,
maybe I am mansplaining, but I think that's good news.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I've been accused of mansplaining too. Yeah, let's just say, I mean, there's lots of parallels, but I have a female physician that I see, and I discuss male health issues with her. Now, I'm rapidly escaping my 50s, about to enter my 60s. So I talk to her about lots of male-related issues at this time in my life, and I don't discount her opinion because she's a woman.
Okay.
She's a trained medical professional, and so I'm coming at this from science and a data-driven approach, and not trying to mansplain to anybody. But that's the dismissive ad hominem quote that you get on Twitter all the time, and it's childish. I think it's simply, yeah. I mean, it's like the person on Instagram today I watched, and it was quite clever. Lauren has got me in on this too. How can you talk about cancer? You've never had a diagnosis of cancer. How can you talk about being overweight and obese because if you've never been overweight and obese? I mean, it's like you have to have the lived experience to be an expert. And I think that's, well, first, it's ridiculous as a notion, but it's often how comments that and I'm sure you've been on the receiving end of some of them, that I make are dismissed as being inaccurate, or that, well, what would I have to say? No lived experience, but here's data, and here's data that we've generated. No, I haven't done my research. We did the research that,
Right.
that you're talking about.
Right. It is, I think, part of the society where women, absolutely in this area, especially by some people, physicians who might not really understand what they're going through,
Mm,
haven't offered a lot of help through menopause.
yeah,
And now this has opened a place to say
yeah,
your protein requirements are different, your exercise requirements are different. And as an endurance guy, when I look at the gold standard meta-analyses that compare age, menopausal status, and adaptation to aerobic exercise, there doesn't seem to be a big difference at all
yeah,
that you could tease out. And that doesn't matter
yeah,
whether it's interval based, lower intensity,
yep,
muscle seems to adapt full stop.
yep,
Let's we will come back later and summarize these protein recommendations so that there's no
sure,
ambiguity about them. Let's move
yeah,
on
yeah,
to that second aspect, which we appreciate protein, but we also appreciate muscle, growing muscle, getting stronger. And
yep,
again, I think there's a lot of confusion about this when non-muscle folk, non-coaches, give recommendations that females peri-post menopause need to lift heavy shit because it's the
yeah,
best way to
yeah,
improve muscle mass and metabolism. And
yeah,
again, I've got a direct quote here. Again, so I'm not quoting out of context. You've heard the phrase lift heavy shit. Incorporating low
yes,
rep, high intensity strength training under 6 repetitions is the key to combating muscle loss, increasing your metabolism, and enhancing your bone density during menopausal years.
yep,
And this is this idea that if you're lifting more than 8 repetitions, that's fine as an introductory tool. But
sure,
females post-menopause really need to be lifting heavy. And we have 7 rep schemes of 5 sets of 5 and 4 sets of
yep,
4. And
yep,
as a coach, I'm working with many women who've read the books and heard the podcast and then have
yep,
injured themselves and being told I need to lift heavy. And as a coach of 30 years, and over 70,000 programs that I've written, this just blows my mind from practice
yeah, yeah,
that this concept has had such mainstream play. You've
Yep.
written numerous systematic reviews, meta-analyses. You've also been part of guidelines for growing muscle with Brad Schoenfeld and a whole host of
Yeah.
other
Yeah. Yeah.
major
Yeah.
experts. So this is also your area of expertise.
Yep.
There's been a bit of a shift. So let's start at the beginning. I and you
Yep.
all grew up in the world where Bill Kramer looked at the role of hormones and muscle mass. And
Yep.
therefore we and everyone in the strength world designed the sets and the reps and the recovery periods to
Yeah.
enhance lactate, growth hormone,
Yep.
testosterone. And
Yep.
I look at all my programs from the 90s, it was all around hormones. And
Yeah.
then you started to question this because you
Yep.
showed that males and females respond similarly despite huge differences in testosterone. And the Kramer model was disassembled by you and others,
Right.
primarily you, to show that the hormones weren't really doing what everyone thought that they did. They're doing something, but
Right.
not
Right.
muscle. Start us with your engagement with the hormone world to where we are today and what's going on when we lift weights that is changing muscle.
Yeah, I think so. The original observation, and this was all driven by data for males, to be very clear, the more weight that you lifted, the greater the intensity. And I use that word in the strict sense of loading. So higher percents of 1 RM really jacked up, as you said, to lactic acid. Lactic acid led to growth hormone release. Growth hormone promotes growth. I mean, it's got growth in the name, like, of course it does. And there's insulin-like growth factor that's a corollary hormone released by the liver as a result of growth hormone. And look, testosterone goes up. These are drivers of muscle growth. So we did a bunch of experiments that manipulated those levels. And essentially, as you said, I mean, I think that every time I think that we sort of, we've written the requiem for the hormone-driven muscle growth. Somebody publishes a paper and says, oh, look here, growth hormone. And as I point out, everybody remembers from their first endocrinology class that if you lack growth hormone, if you don't have it, so primary hypopituitarism, you're not under muscled, you're just short. You're a dwarf, right? You have dwarfism. Or if you have hyperpituitarism, you're tall. It's not like people who are short in stature, little people, are cachectic. And it's not tall people, giants, quote unquote, are massively muscled. The most popular, everybody's watched The Princess Bride, so I always use that. That's Andre the Giant. He was Canadian and a great wrestler, but he was kind of just a round, pudgy guy, but he was super tall. But he didn't have muscles that are now. Testosterone definitely works. And if you take it exogenously as a steroid hormone, it works. There's no question. But the transient rise you get in testosterone post-exercise is so small, so short-lived. It's within the normal diurnal variation. And then Jim Krieger and I think maybe I want to say Alan Aragon and Brandon Roberts did a meta-analysis showing that boys and girls, same amount of muscle, equally as fast. Puberty happens. Boys, they get the testosterone surge, and everybody goes, well, look, they see testosterone's important. I'm like, yeah, they're getting it 24/7, 365 times 8, 9 years. And everybody after 18 stops, and men are up here and women are here. But then when they lift weights, everybody goes up and down, relatively speaking, to the same degree. And I thought, oh, that's it. That's the death knell for testosterone. Like, we don't have to talk about that anymore. Women have tenfold less testosterone. And some people are like, well, but free testosterone. And I'm like, we can manipulate that too. And the differences become inconsequential. But there's a big focus during menopause on testosterone being a driver of anabolism, and lots of women experience great effects on it. But I defer to I think the world's expert, Professor Susan Davis, and she's like, we don't have the data. So enter the postmenopausal phase, and everybody goes, well, women postmenopausal are a different beast. They don't have estrogen, and that was an anabolic hormone. Now they don't have it, so they are anabolically resistant. And I'm like, they're anabolically resistant because they're older and they don't do as much. Most women, I'm fond of this statistic, 80% of women, and this is by self-report, so it's probably higher, do not lift weights at all. So the lift heavy shit it's strategy, but it's not the strategy. So you can lift lighter weights, and as long as you work hard, you end up gaining muscle the same as you would with heavy weights. You don't get as strong, but that's a practice phenomenon. It's easy to explain to a coach, right? So
Yeah.
somebody lifts at 50, you're 50% away from your max lift. Somebody lifts at 80, you're only 20% away. And then you use the max lift to test strength. Well, who's going to get better? Like the person who's only 20% away. But then use an unpracticed task and everybody gets equally as strong. So, that again is another, it's a non-starter.
I've never understood it, because if you are lifting 15 reps or 20 reps, you're getting stronger at 15 or 20 reps. And every coach knows this. You start at 5 kilos next week, end of the program, you're now doing 20 reps. So you got stronger, but you're confusing maximal strength versus getting stronger. And I think that's a public message that's really missed. That we advocate, of course, maximal strength training, but we also advocate strength training full stop. And you were one of the authors. You actually changed my mind on this, because again, coming from the 90s and I'm from the Bill Kramer school of thought, is that you really did challenge this motor unit recruitment across the spectrum in practice. That is, if you're we had very discrete rep ranges, and I think every coach knows what I'm talking about. If you want to get maximally stronger, 1 to 5 reps, hypertrophy, 8 to 12, anything above that's not working on muscle. And you did some multiple studies looking at very high rep work, showing the first, and I remember the first study came out, I thought, this can't be true. This can't be true. In other words, everything that I had ever learned.
Well, Brad Schoenfeld said it wasn't true either.
Right.
He goes, that can't be true. No. So he did his own study, and it was the same. And I was like, and he goes, you know what? Brad's he's an awesome guy. I had the privilege of speaking on programs with him a number of times. And flat out, I got to give him credit. It is tough to say I've said I'm wrong several times, but Brad, he goes, you know what? You were right on that. That was. And Brad's done several meta-analyses that show that lighter weights beget the same amount of muscle mass as heavier weight. And everybody goes, but you get stronger. And I'm like, because you practice.
You're right.
You know,
so
the zone you lift.
What is actually then, if you are doing 15 reps versus, let's call it 15 to 20 versus 8 to 10?
Sure.
What is actually going on after that set that generates muscle mass? I don't think anyone has ever really stopped in the public to think, what's actually going on here when I'm doing a hip thrust or a chest press or a squat, and I'm doing 8 reps, but versus 15 reps.
Sure.
We used to think it was the hormones that were released. You showed that wasn't the case. And you've used this word effort.
Yes.
What's important that people need to know when they're lifting weights?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that your muscles have no idea whether you're lifting a kettlebell, a machine, or anything. It's just your brain says, we need to lift this thing. It sends what we call motor drive, and we recruit motor units within the muscle. And these motor units innervate lots of different muscle fibers, and with these muscle fibers contract. And if you have enough motor units, enough muscle fibers active, you're able to lift the weight. Sometimes you try as hard as you can and you just can't lift the weight. Doesn't matter. It's a kettlebell, you can't swing it. A machine, you can't push it, or something like that. But it's the motor unit recruitment that drives muscle fiber activation. And go back to basic principles. Muscle fibers are either on or off. There's no, I'm kind of halfway on. They either fire and contract or they don't. Then everybody wants to get into all kinds of fancy things, so we won't talk about that. But it really is click, 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 click. And heavy lifting is like you're like click, and there's a lot of motor units turned on, and then they're off, they relax, lift the weight, lower the weight, lift the weight, lower the weight. And then at some point, I think everybody who's lifted heavier weights, it's like you're bang, and the weight slams to the floor, and you've reached fatigue, voluntary fatigue. 15 to 20 reps, you still get to fatigue, and the recruitment of motor units that you're trying to drive still has all the motor units switched on. They come on in a different fashion. They're slightly different, but the fatigue you get at the end of 15 to 20 reps is not the slam. It's sort of like you get that, I call it sewing machine. You're like, and you're starting to shake and quiver, and that's a metabolic sort of stress, but it's still fatigue. And at fatigue, you try and drive motor unit recruitment, you switch muscle fibers on, they become active. And it's basically mechanical tension that is, I think, and we've got a great paper with some collaborators in the United States coming out. It's heavy stuff, but it's I think one of the first identifications of which mechanical portion of the muscle is turned on. It's not hormones.
Yeah. So let's double click on that, because I think part of the argument has been made, and it makes sense, that as we age, we lose fast twitch muscle fibers. We know power goes first, then strength, then muscle.
Yeah.
And so let's put it in the context of a female who's reading this and confused. I'm aging, I'm losing my fast twitch fibers, and strength training, heavy stuff, under 6 repetitions, recruits fast twitch fibers. So that's what I need to do. That's the argument.
Right.
And what you're saying is that at fatigue, whether it's 5 reps or 15 reps or 30 reps, if you are approaching fatigue, you're using fast twitch. Am I quoting you correctly?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're recruited in a slightly different pattern, but you tap into them because we call it the size principle of how these motor units are recruited. But at fatigue, you try, if you're programming and you're just effort and you're like, you don't need to go to fatigue first. But I mean, when you approach it, you're driving motor unit recruitment as hard as you can so you can do that last rep. And if you didn't, then you couldn't do it. So failure, fatigue, or voluntary, whatever you want to call it, momentary muscular failure, fatigue, happens with heavy weights sooner than it does with lighter weights, but you still reach the same outcome in terms of muscle growth. And I know a lot of people go, oh, there's greater neuromuscular fatigue. And I'm like, well, I'm not saying lift lighter weights all the time.
All the time.
Or you know what? Like somebody goes, well, there's greater fatigue. I'm like, oh, okay, take a day off. And they go, but my athletes, I'm like, whoa, hold on. 80% of women don't lift weights. 70% of men don't lift weights. And so I'm talking to some mere mortals who might want to start lifting weights. And all we're doing is giving them an alternative way. But when people say, and this is where the great really comes in, it's like, you have to lift like this. And there's actually sort of almost a shaming of lifting the pink dumbbells. And I'm like, you know what? Who lifted the pink dumbbells? Well, you. Nobody else. You did it. And that to me is, for a lot of people, that's a big win. And I get it. Everybody then goes, oh, the effectiveness. And I'm like, okay, but the entry to the activity is still doing something. And that's a big deal.
That is a big deal. And as a coach, we use all the rep ranges, and you have to start somewhere. And I know, especially as I age as well, and my joints, and I've done a lot of exercise, I self-select higher reps because it's easier on my back and my elbows and my knees. And I think the public message is that is not any worse a training than 5 sets of 5 because of this whole idea about muscle fibers. So I think that's a really clear myth busting, that you only use your fast twitch. And it's also the same message with interval training, that when you do interval training, you use your fast twitch fibers. Well, you can't just do interval training all year round, right? And any coach would say that. We have very limited time remaining. So one last question, and then we're going to summarize.
Sure.
You've done a lot of work on protein and amino acids. You've also looked at collagen, and your colleagues have looked at collagen as well. And as I understand, there's 2 primary arguments for the use of collagen. And that is it's working on bone, tendon, ligaments, skin, nails. And the other with this new work is that it's on pain as well. It's doing something else via pain pathways. Let's wrap this all into a conversation of what is collagen, and what have you found it relative to normal protein in the diet on the topics we've just discussed?
Sure. So collagen, it comes from animal products. I know that some people, they talk about vegetarian or vegan collagen. There is no such thing, even though some people sell it. They're lying to you. So bones, skin, feathers, things that come from the rendering plant after the animal's been slaughtered, we boil that stuff up. We get collagen that comes out of it. As a protein, it has a quality score, and people can appreciate this. Like milk protein has a quality score of 100. Collagen has a quality score of 0. And that's because it's deficient in one essential amino acid, which is tryptophan. And it's very low in a lot of other essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein that we need. So we can't make them, we need to eat them. So I often make the point, and I know it's kind of a trite situation, but if you're stuck on a desert island and you've got like milk protein, all good. They might be bored after a while, but you'll live. You're stuck with collagen, you're going to die. Like you just don't have the one essential amino acid that you need. And so you'll begin to break down. So, but then everybody goes, oh, well, that's not a problem because I'm eating other proteins. I'm like, awesome. So then they say, well, it's the non-essential amino acids that are present in high abundance in our collagenous tissues. So skin, bones, hair, nails, etc., and connective tissue that are being fed by the collagen protein. And I'm like, I can sort of understand that to some degree, but what I would say is that the majority of the evidence when we've looked at like promoting muscle collagen synthesis, and muscle doesn't have a lot of collagen, but does have some, is that it doesn't do that. And it's not very good at promoting anything to do with muscle. And everybody goes, oh, connective tissue. And I'm like, show me some good human data. And it's always collagen versus nothing. So there's no, it's an empty, a hollow placebo. It's carbohydrate or like a zero calorie taste match placebo. And I say, well, let's compare collagen to like whey and see how they do. And when you do that, all of the differences essentially disappear and they collapse. So I think collagen, which was sprayed on farmers' fields as fertilizer 30 years ago, has enjoyed a revival that's driven almost strictly through marketing. And then everybody goes, what about skin? Right. Yeah, and I'm like, right. I don't know. Yeah. Because I don't study skin. Right. But if it reduced wrinkles, I'm like, I'm all in too. But...
Right. And what about the pain? Because in the last year or so, we've seen, I think, 2 papers have looked at pain, and I just don't know what to make of it.
No, well, I don't know enough about pain to really comment on them. I'm surprised. And when I do have a colleague 5 doors down from me, and I say to her, look at this. And she's like, I don't believe that. So
yeah. And you're right. It's often compared versus nothing. And is this what we also see in the pre-sleep, pre-bed protein? You're having protein or you're not, and they're not matching the protein in the day. So when I look at the benefit of pre-bed protein, it's often viewed against not comparing it with apples. Is that your thoughts on it as well?
Yeah, I mean, pre-sleep protein, friends who have done this work, Luke Van Loon, Mike Ormsby, I think there's a small benefit to it again, but I think it's pretty deep in the margins. To my experience and talking to sort of coaches, they promote it to their athletes to keep, a lot of people feel full and they sleep better. Yeah. And who could argue with better sleep? Yeah, like I could use some of that, right? But outside of that, when you look at what potentially it could do, I'm like, it's so deep in the margins compared to just getting your protein intake throughout the day.
Stu, I could keep talking forever. And again, I looked at maybe 1/50th of the questions I wanted to ask you. You've done more for our industry, for women, and I think a lot of women don't realize this, but you and your team have done more for our understanding about protein and resistance training and muscle as it ages, more than anyone else. So a big thank you. Thank you for making the time to have this conversation. Thank you for all the work that you do.
You're very welcome.
Your public engagement has been just amazing as well. So thanks for your time.
Appreciate that. Thank you. No problem at all. I can't leave you. It's like me, because as I said, you've had Lauren on, and there's lots of other bright young people who I bask in their reflected hard work, and they do the work. And yeah. But thank you. Those are generous words.
Thanks, Stu.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found today's episode as valuable as I did. If you're interested in going deeper into the science of how women respond to training and how to actually apply that in the real world, I'd love to invite you to join me for the Science of Thriving. It's a 9-week course I've created for both coaches and individuals, combining the latest science and research With lessons from over 30 years of coaching, you can head to the Science of Thriving to learn more and sign up. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next week in the next episode.